Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be finally diving into the Ultimate 10th Edition Eldar tier list. So this is a video I wanted to do for a while, but really wanted to wait until the meta calmed down a little bit after 10th Edition to do it. A lot of people were doing tier lists basically right when 10th Edition came out, and I wanted to wait a little bit to see what stuck and, what units were actually good and what weren't. Because as you guys know, I'm somebody who really likes to get experience with units and give them a fair shot before, condemning them. So that's what I did here. I gave a lot of these units a fair shot, played them in several games. I even played Storm Guardians a couple times. And I have to say, they're better than they were last edition. Let's just put it that way. However, some of the units on this tier list, just going to be real with you guys, I haven't used. And when I talk about those units, you guys will know why. So without further ado, let us go ahead and jump right in and start talking about what units belong where in the Eldar Index. Okay, but real quick before we begin, there are some units I'm not going to be including. So I'm sorry if any of you are disappointed by this, but these units are kind of hard to compare with the rest of the units in the index and probably deserve their own separate videos, which I will be doing within the next couple weeks. Those units are all the legend units. So Bone Singers, Wasp Assault Walkers, things like that, I won't be including in today's video. I also won't be including super heavy tanks and titans because truthfully, I don't really think those units belong in small games, Strike Force games, 2,000 point games or less. They don't really belong well and they don't really compare well at that point level. So unfortunately, I won't be including those either. They'll have their separate videos later on. Also, Dark Eldar units. So they can only be taken with Yvraine as your warlord, and I didn't think that was a good comparison to make to the rest of the units in the index, just because, there's only a specific circumstance in which you can include them. And that's basically it, though. I did include most of the Imperial armor units, aside from the super heavies, and even though I didn't include Legends units, I will end up covering those probably later next week. Okay, so as for the tiers and what they mean, because I want to give you guys some context as to what each tier means when I put a unit in it. S tier is top of the line and best in slot for most competitive builds. A tier is going to be a great unit that is extremely effective in the role. B tier is going to be a solid unit but has some minor issues. C tier is a weaker unit that has more serious issues. And D tier is a really weak unit that needs a lot of help or investment to be good. Okay, so starting off with the first unit, we have Rangers. Now, Rangers are an S tier unit. They have great objective play, they have cheap objective holding or screening, which is very important in this game. You do need to screen your units well. Eldar are mostly a shooting army, so you're going to need to protect your more fragile pieces. They do have assault weapons as well. Their pistols are assault weapons, so they can advance and be eligible to shoot for actions, so for those secondary objectives, which make them a great utility unit as well. They have decent precision damage, so they can pop up a few wounds against characters if they need to. And lastly, they are a fantastic denial unit. So because they have the infiltrate ability, they're able to deny space on the board from enemy infiltrators and other things like that. And on top of all that, they're a pretty cheap unit. They're only 55 points for 5, so that makes them pretty expendable. So they can also be used to bait out more expensive units in your opponent's army. So if they're on an objective scoring points, your opponent is going to want to kill them, and then when your opponent moves out, you'll be hopefully in position to take advantage of that. So yeah, I really have nothing bad to say about these guys either. I think they do their job very well, and they give you a really good leg up in the board control game and also the objective game. The next unit is kind of similar, but the combat version of Rangers basically, which is Striking Scorpions, and they are an A tier unit. The reason why is because they have good melee output for the cost. In an edition where combat got nerfed pretty heavily, these guys still hit reasonably hard, and pretty much the same as they did last edition for the most part. And as a decent combat unit, they're great at applying pressure from reserve or via infiltrate. So your opponent is not going to want to deploy near board edges or near them when they infiltrate forward. So very good board control unit. Again, I've seen a lot of competitive lists with at least one unit of these guys just to apply that extra pressure on your opponent, keep them away from the board edges so that you can control those areas of the board a little bit easier. And because of that, even though these guys are a combat unit and combat is generally nerfed, they still have a lot of value in competitive Eldar armies. So they definitely earned their A tier spot. Dire Avengers are up next, and Dire Avengers are a great example of an A tier unit. So why? Well, they have powerful shooting with lethal hits, but that's not really the reason they're A tier. They're A tier because they're a great denial unit due to their enhanced overwatch. When they control an objective or are in range of an objective that you control, they get to overwatch on a 4+, which is insane, and gives them a really great amount of board control presence for only one command point. The other hidden thing behind this is that a lot of armies now have, abilities or items or enhancements that essentially make your stratagems cost more, right? They make them cost 1 more. And having a unit of Dire Avengers that can move up onto an objective turn 1 and force your opponent to consider using it on the Overwatch stratagem is a great way of making it easier for your army to Phantasm and Fire and Fade, because that's the alternative, right? If you don't have a unit like this, then your opponent is just going to use it on Phantasm, which you are going to be probably using every turn, or on Fire and Fade, which will limit your mobility a lot. And basically being able to bait out your opponent and say, hey, look, I overwatch on a 4+, gives your opponent pause and forces them to think about using it on Overwatch instead of Fire and Fade or Phantasm, which is another kind of hidden thing that these guys are great at doing. So overall, Dire Avengers are definitely an A tier unit. They can play mind games with their opponent and deny big parts of the board from their infantry. Okay, now we have the Warlock Skyrunner. So I know what you guys are thinking. The Warlock Skyrunner is not that great, right? Yes, he can attach to Wind Riders, give them solid buffs with either stealth or ignores cover, but to get the greatest use out of it, you're going to need to have a big squad of Wind Riders, and maybe that's not the most efficient thing. However, I decided to put the Warlock Skyrunner in B tier, not only for that, but for his ability to run as a solo operative, and again, not a lone operative, but just alone, not with a unit, so that he can hide easily and perform objectives or get to certain areas of the board. So he's only 55 points, and for 55 points, which is just as much as a ranger unit, he can basically move very fast, right? He moves 14 inches plus advance, and he can easily get behind obscuring terrain, and because he's small enough, he can hide easily as well. So if you need something that's very quick and, just basically wants to sneak behind enemy lines so that you can score on things like behind enemy lines or deploy teleport homers and things like this, you might want to consider just running a Warlock Skyrunner by himself. And yeah, I do know that we have units that can already do this, like Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders, but they're a bit more expensive. And if you're just looking for something expendable that you don't mind losing, but can also score pretty easy objective points in the early game when your opponent still has a lot of models on the table, then I think this is where you go with it, right? And I've used this in a couple games to some effect. Yes, the Warlock Skyrunner has gotten behind enemy lines and has been able to deploy teleport homers as well. And because, yes, this model does indeed have assault weapons with the twin-linked shuriken catapult, you can also advance and perform actions as well. So this model is a great action monkey, can do a lot of actions and stuff like that for you, is very easy to hide. And if you wanted to have him join Wind Riders, he's also pretty effective at buffing them as well. And so while most people would rate the Warlock Skyrunner lower on this tier list, I actually think he has a lot more value than some of you may think. Howling Banshees, however, are another story. So Howling Banshees took quite the tumble this edition. They were once an S or A tier unit, and now they're a C tier unit. And that's because even though they are a fast melee unit, their damage is subpar without support, and they're very vulnerable to Overwatch. So yeah, they have strikes first, they can advance and charge, and they can get to enemy units to fight them. But once they actually do fight them, they need support or they will lose, and they will essentially after that be useless. Because once they make their attacks, if they don't do enough damage, they are going to get hit back very hard. They don't have -1 to hit anymore in combat, so they're essentially going to get squished by a lot of units that are out there. And in general, compared to the other combat units in our index, I just don't think Howling Banshees are that great, right? Striking Scorpions can also basically do the same thing. Yeah, they can advance and charge, but most likely if they're in a Falcon, they will be able to disembark 3 inches. And with, Fate Dice, they can easily get into combat and do a lot more damage. Same thing with Harlequin troops as well. And both of those previously mentioned units are much better at actually killing the target they hit. So, yeah, Howling Banshees, you can definitely fit them in an army. They can definitely work, and you can get them to work, but I just don't think they compare well to the other units in our index. Okay, so moving on to Warlocks. So these are just Warlocks on foot, the single character. I rated this as B tier as well, and here's why. I don't think they're any good when matched up with Guardians. I actually think they're terrible when matched up with Guardians. They really don't offer Guardians much at all. Yes, they can give their unit an auto advance 6 inches or enemies at a -2 charge, but he can also do this if he's run as a solo operative. So basically just run alone, right? I'm not talking about a lone operative here. I'm just saying that you don't attach him to anything. And when he's not attached to anything, he can auto advance 6 inches by himself. He has decent shooting, and he is the cheapest unit that can advance and perform objectives. So if you need to deploy teleport homers or, perform some other kind of objective early in the game, this guy can basically auto advance 6 inches, moving a total of 13 inches, getting to the center of the board, score that objective, and also be able to hide. And if your opponent does have something to kill him, it's not a huge waste of an investment, right? He's only 45 points. He dies. That's it. No big deal. And at that point, he's also more expendable than Rangers. So if you do need something that can score on objectives early on in the game and also is very easy to hide from your opponent, maybe consider taking a solo Warlock. And I think that alone earns him a B tier spot. Not the best unit, obviously, but one that can be very useful in the right situations. Okay, moving on to one of my favorite units, the Shroud Runners. So I put these guys in S tier because not only are they a great damage multiplier with their mark target ability, but they're also a fantastic utility unit. They can also score quite easily in objectives. So they have Scout 9, which is effective at getting up the board quick and allows them, if you get the first turn, to get in the enemy deployment zone right off the bat. They also have pretty solid shooting for the cost, and if you do want to run them as a bigger unit, they're a great target for guide. They also benefit quite well from their own lethal hits. And lastly, their shuriken pistols mean that they can advance and still score on secondary objectives. So overall, I think this is a very powerful unit. The reason why you guys don't see these as much in competitive lists is because everybody is just running mortal wound spam now, and lethal hits does not synergize well with mortal wound spam. But if we see the balance update changing anything in September and nerfing the units that have devastating wounds, then we might well see Shroud Runners rise all the way to the top and start basically making their appearance in highly competitive tournament lists. All right, next up we have the Viper. So the Viper I put in A tier because it can remove a target's cover, making it easier to kill. There's just tons of things now that give cover, so having something that can remove that at will is very powerful. It has a low profile and it's easy to hide. It can also take powerful ranged weapons like the Bright Lance, which synergizes extremely well with their detachment ability to reroll 1 hit and 1 wound. And in a pinch, you can also do a nice little cheeky tank shock with it because it does have a strength 5 Wraithbone hull. So yeah, overall, I think the Viper is a very good pick. Definitely A tier. You see it on a lot of competitive lists because it can ignore cover and because it packs a powerful punch for its cost, in addition to its utility role. All right, so moving on to support weapons, which are S tier, but I'm not talking about all the support weapons. I'm really just talking about the D cannon. The D cannon is really the only one that is that good, right? And the reason why it's good is because it has massive devastating wound potential and just massive damage in general. It's very accurate due to the heavy keyword, even when firing at a line of sight, and it's a great area denial tool. On top of that, it can debuff non-vehicles and monsters hit with a -1 to hit, because of its artillery barrage special rule, and the Shuriken Catapult can also split fire to achieve this if it's in line of sight and range. Look at that. You don't even need to fire the D cannon at a target you want to debuff. You can just fire the Shuriken Catapult at it. If you have line of sight, that is. And yeah, I think this is a very powerful unit overall. Yes, we did get nerfed with the Fate dice recently. We can only use 1 per phase. But the fact of the matter remains that this thing, even though it can't just kill everything like a Wraith Knight can or something like that, can do very accurate damage, and because it's indirect fire, it still packs a really hard punch against tough targets. After all, on average, it's going to get about 2 shots against a tough target, and you will hit probably both of them with a reroll, and you'll probably wound both of them with a reroll. So if your opponent has a 4+ invul save and you don't manage to get a 6, that's still D6 + 2 damage going through on average. which is nothing to sneeze at. This thing does cost 105 points, which is quite a lot, but it is well worth it because it can deny a large area of the board from your opponent and make it very hard for them to advance without taking some casualties. On the other hand, the webway gate is all the way at the bottom in D tier. So the webway gate, like all fortifications in the game right now, is just not in a very good place. It's extremely expensive, just like all other fortifications from every other army. They have to start in your deployment zone and they can be destroyed. So essentially, right then and there, that is a recipe for just a terrible unit. The bonuses that it gives you aren't really great, as being in strategic reserve and being able to come in behind the enemy army turns 3 and onward is just always going to be better. So yeah, the webway gate definitely earns its D tier spot, and I actually think compared to other armies in the game, it's possibly the worst fortification, just in terms of how expensive it truly is as well. And up next, we also have not such a great unit in my opinion, the Warlock Skyrunner Conclave. I put this in C tier, and the reason I have it in C tier is because it's an expensive unit. It only gives Feel No Pain versus psychic attacks, and even though it basically has Fortune, the unit's always going to be at -1 to wound, it's really expensive. And they do have decent damage, but not for the cost you pay. These guys are 50 points a model. For 2 of them, it costs 100 points. 10 Guardians hunkered down behind some, obscuring terrain is most likely going to be more survivable than this unit. And yeah, it's one of the units that can be a bodyguard for a Farseer Skyrunner, but a Farseer Skyrunner really doesn't need this unit because you have Wind Riders. Wind Riders are a little bit squishier, but they do a lot more damage at range and are a lot safer because they have a higher range on their weapons. They don't really need to expose themselves as often. And the other kind of shitty thing about this unit is that half of its abilities are predicated on whether or not a Farseer is joined to them. So overall, just don't really think it's a strong unit. It's a lot of points. Its points cost doesn't reflect the damage they can do. And I think there are just much better options in the Codex in general. And even for the Farseer Skyrunner, either running him alone or with Wind Riders is a far superior choice. And really, that's just my opinion and what I've gathered over a couple games using them. I think the solo Skyrunner is probably much better than these guys just because of the fact that, you can use him or her for other things. But for this unit, it's just too expensive, right? You're not going to use it for actions because it's really too expensive for that. You don't want to spend 100 points on something that is going to be an action junkie, right? And at the same time, they really don't do a good job supporting Farseers. So yeah, I just think this unit's kind of in a weird place and it's really too expensive right now to be considered that good. But if the cost decreases or something like that in the future, I could see this unit being a decent pick. Okay, so now we have the Yin Karn. So let me just start off by saying this. The Yin Karn is absolutely an S tier unit. It is much better even than it was last edition. It's extremely tough with high defensive stats and it halves all damage on top of it. It can teleport to destroyed units once per phase, and then shoot or charge normally afterward. There's basically no restrictions anymore. Last edition, there were restrictions to this. You couldn't charge after you teleported. And now in this edition, you can, which is awesome. It has also great shooting and close combat ability. It has either sweeps, which sweep aside heavy infantry very well, or strikes, which can penetrate through big stuff pretty easily. Now, this thing does have a weakness. It's really kind of hard to use it against big stuff, right? So anything that is really tough and has an invul save, this thing sometimes has the potential to bounce against. But other than that, as long as it has support, it's very strong. And can be used in a number of tricky ways to basically get behind enemy lines and start devastating your opponent's backline. One of the best things to do with this unit actually is to basically just destroy something small in your opponent's backline. Use your greater mobility as an Eldar player to get behind the enemy with something, kill an enemy unit, and then teleport the Yin Karn to that unit and wreak absolute havoc. I actually really like striking scorpions for this because basically what this does is you can infiltrate a unit of striking scorpions next to something kind of, maybe a little bit more squishy. And your opponent is then going to either have to hide from the scorpions or kill the scorpions and have the Yin Karn come out. So it kind of gives you a win-win scenario, in which case either your scorpions start performing better than they normally should, or your Yin Karn gets an easy teleport in the beginning of the game. So yeah, the Yin Karn kicks some serious ass, and it definitely belongs in S tier in my opinion. So now moving on to a unit that has fallen from grace a bit, let's say flown the coop, and that is Baharoth. Baharoth is, in my opinion, now a B tier unit. The reason why I think he's B tier is even though he does give Swooping Hawks a considerable boost with +1 to hit and a 6-inch move after they shoot, you really shouldn't be using Swooping Hawks in this way. I think there are just better units for damage, and especially because Shadow Specters get this ability for free, and so do Scourges if you're using your Vrain. So you're essentially paying over 100 points for a 6-inch move after you shoot. Whereas you can get that for free if you use the squad of Shadow Specters or, Scourges if you were, playing a Ynnari army. He is a decent combatant, but he's not anywhere close to amazing. He doesn't do the damage of the other Phoenix Lords. He has decent shooting and decent combat, but nothing special. He also does have some cool synergy when using Skyleap, but it is situational. So technically you can come in from reserve, deep strike in, shoot something, and then move 6 inches afterward. And that's great and everything, but again, it's just a little bit situational. Sometimes it's useful and just sometimes it's not. So overall, I do think Baharoth is decent. I think if you definitely want to include him in your list, then he's not a bad pick. He's just not optimal, and I think other units can essentially do what he does better, and for less points. All right, so up next, we probably have one of the most iconic models of 9th edition, the Farseer Skyrunner. So in 10th edition, it is still an absolute beast, and it's definitely an S tier unit. It can guide friendly units, allowing them to reroll to hit. It can change a fate dice used nearby to a 6, and it's very fast and maneuverable and can run comfortably as a solo piece or in a unit of Wind Riders. So it's equally comfortable in both, in my opinion. It is very easy to hide, so the only thing you have to fear really is really strong indirect fire or things that ignore line of sight. Other than that, he's pretty safe, and again, if you are running on a board where the bottom story of ruins are totally blocked, you won't have to worry about towering units. And I'm just going to take a quick moment to also mention that the Farseer Skyrunner also has Eldritch Storm. So he can do a fair bit of damage himself, especially on a jet bike. If you give him the Singing Spear, he already comes with Twin Shuriken Catapults and Eldritch Storm as well. He can punch pretty hard against heavy infantry and has the maneuverability to actually use it more than his foot counterpart. So yeah, overall, I think it's a very strong model. Not only can he buff friendly units with the fate dice change and guide, but he can also do some significant damage on his own. So moving on to Eldrad. Eldrad was someone who in the beginning of the edition was basically an auto take. You wanted to take him for those extra fate dice. He gave you 3 extra fate dice, but now because fate dice are limited to once per phase, he's kind of fallen out of favor. However, I still think that Eldrad is an A tier unit because of his Doom ability. Doom makes enemy units easier to wound, which gives you a +1 to wound, and this makes Eldrad very important for playing denial type games, where you don't want an enemy unit to move to a certain area of the board. And if your opponent knows you have Doom in combination with Mind War, which can kill an enemy character in a unit, even though it's a bit risky, your opponent's probably not going to want to always risk that. So may keep their unit out of line of sight or, give up a good position on the battlefield just to avoid that combination. It also helps, other units kill enemy units faster. The 3 extra fate dice might not be that big of a deal, but it can help you get better results if you roll bad. So typically, if you have 12 dice and you roll it a couple times and don't see any 6s, you're just going to stop rolling because you're just going to keep getting worse and worse and worse every time, right? You're going to have 1 less dice every time. But if you have Eldrad in your army, giving you those 3 extra fate dice, it gives you a little bit of a buffer to where you can still reliably get at least 2 6s, if not more. And let me give you an example real quick of a game I played. So after the nerf, I was running Eldrad in one of my lists, and the first roll I rolled my 15 dice, and no 5s, no 6s. I know that's a shocker, but it happens, right? There was a bunch of 4s, a bunch of 3s, and some 1s and 2s. And I thought to myself, well, I could keep this, but this is a garbage roll. It's not going to help me proc any cool abilities on devastating wounds or anything like that. So I decided to re-roll it. And once again, I rolled terribly. I didn't get a single 6. I only got a couple 5s. And I thought to myself, well, I might as well re-roll it again, right? Because I have Eldrad, because I have that buffer of a few extra dice, it kind of allows me the leeway to roll more if I don't like my result at the beginning of the game. Whereas if I didn't have Eldrad, I probably wouldn't risk it because at that point, I'm only rolling 9 dice. My chances of getting a 6 are getting lower and lower and lower and lower. So I might as well just stop re-rolling. So Eldrad gave me that little bit of a buffer. And guess what? I rolled for the 3rd time and I got like 4 6s on that roll. So Eldrad, even though 3 extra dice doesn't seem like that big of a deal, it can help you, secure a better roll in the beginning of the game. So while definitely not the S tier unit he was at the beginning of the edition, he's definitely still a solid pick in a lot of lists. And then we come to the Farseer. So the Farseer is an S tier unit, obviously. Changes a fate dice to a 6 when used nearby, which is basically what really competitive players are using with Wraith Knights. They're just using a Farseer in the back, hiding him behind some ruins, and just farming this ability to give devastating wounds out to their Wraith Knights and, of course, D-Cannons. He also gives a unit Fortune, which is -1 wound when attacked. And having -1 to wound is an amazing defensive ability. So it basically gives Wraith Knights a step up when having to deal with a lot of heavy weapon shooting that's going to be targeting them. And it even gives units like Guardians a bit of a fighting chance when going up against indirect fire. Farseers are very happy joining Guardians or just cowering behind true line of sight blocking terrain. So if they're on the bottom story of a ruin behind it, it's going to block true line of sight in most competitive settings, which make them immune to towering models. However, beware, because indirect fire can still hurt and kill a lone Farseer by himself. Farseers are only toughness 3 and they only have 4 wounds. So you do have to watch out for that when running a Farseer alone without a Guardian squad to protect him. Okay, so moving on to the Harlequin Troop. The Harlequin Troop I put in B tier. Now, a lot of you might be wondering, well, Proxy Hammer, why didn't you put it in A tier? I mean, you put Striking Scorpions in A tier. Harlequins must also be an A tier unit, right? Now, I think looking at Harlequins and comparing them to the other melee units in the index, they do require a little bit more support than other units that are effective, namely Striking Scorpions. So it's actually a good comparison, and this is why I figured they were actually in B tier versus A tier. Because if you compare them to Striking Scorpions have very similar damage profiles, and Scorpions have Infiltrate. And I really don't think that the 1 inch of extra movement and the slightly better durability against high AP weapons with the 4+ invul versus a 5+ is enough to propel the Harlequins past the Scorpions as far as a, top tier Eldar close combat unit. They are still good, don't get me wrong. I mean, they do have decent durability against low volume, high AP weapons. They're fast and they're reasonably hard hitting. But that hard hitting comes with support. You do have to invest in a Troop Master, and oftentimes you will have to invest in a transport, whereas Striking Scorpions can just infiltrate, right? They don't really need a transport to be effective in their role. And I think what also stings a little bit about the Harlequin Troop is they lost a lot in the transition to 10th that made them unique. So yes, they are a solid combat unit, and you definitely can get very good value out of them. But they're just a little bit less competitive than Striking Scorpions, so that's why I ended up putting them in B tier. Okay, so speaking of, we also have the Starweaver, which I also put in B tier. Now, the Starweaver and the Harlequins together synergize very well. It's very cost-effective as a transport, it has decent damage and survivability, and allows units to hop back in after the fight phase if not engaged. So this allows your Harlequins to play a little bit more aggressively, but still have the safety of being able to hop back in to a transport and not get shot at. So individually, Harlequins may indeed lose out to Striking Scorpions, but when you consider all the support that Harlequins can get, you start to get a different picture. So the Starweaver is a piece of the puzzle to this, and, it doesn't just benefit Harlequin troops, it also benefits Death Jesters as well as Solitaires. However, be warned, if the Death Jester is inside of the Starweaver, he's not going to be able to use his ability to shoot out. So you definitely want to disembark him before you end up shooting with them. Okay, so moving on to the Troop Masters. Troop Masters are great damage multipliers of the unit they join. They give them devastating wounds, which makes them hit a lot harder against a lot of different types of targets. He can also change a fate dice used on him to a 6, which is worthless. I think that part of the ability really is bad ever since the changes to Strains of Fate. But it is still something, in the later turns of the game when you have nothing better to use, low impact fate dice on, this might be useful. But just don't count on it to do anything spectacular. So True Masters, pretty solid damage multiplier. Have no real complaints about them. They're definitely in B tier. They're a good, character. They just don't do much more for the unit besides increase its damage. Okay, so next we have Fire Dragons. So Fire Dragons are a unit that are going to be kind of controversial in the position I picked them in. I think they're an A tier unit. A lot of people are going to tell me, and I know I'm already going to get this in the comments, Proxy Hammer, Fire Dragons aren't really that good. We have so many other great anti-tank options. Fire Dragons just fall short. They're not good at killing tanks. Well, I have to disagree. And here's why. They're only 85 points, which makes them really cost-effective against lighter vehicles and medium vehicles. Anything toughness 9 or below, they're going to be very cost-effective against. Against tougher targets, if they are in a Falcon, which you will take them in a Falcon, no one is saying you should run these guys on foot or anything like that. If they are in a Falcon, they're rerolling wounds, which helps them hit much harder against tougher targets. They also get to reroll damage rolls of 1, which is really good. It helps them hit a lot harder and basically ensures that you're not going to whiff really bad on a damage roll once you do actually wound the target. No joke, I've one-shotted Redemptor Dreadnoughts and Carnifexes with these guys. And also Terminators. I've also shot these guys at Terminators once they're done killing their tanks, and they've done pretty good against them as well. Yeah, your opponent will get a 4+ invul save, but every failed save is a dead Termi. And again, these guys are only 85 points. So if you lose them after you kill your target, after you kill more than their points are worth, it's not a big deal. They made a good trade, and they forced your opponent to have to now target them, which could leave them open to other avenues of attack. So yeah, I think this is a great unit, and in my opinion, an A tier unit that I think we'll see a lot more of once D weapons and stuff like that inevitably get nerfed this September. And now it's time for my favorite unit of all time, the Storm Guardians. And yeah, actually, I can't even lie. These guys, I hate these guys, but they're actually pretty good this edition. Now, they're not the best unit in the index, but they're not also the worst unit like they were in 9th edition. They're a B tier unit. They have sticky objectives, they have decent durability with the Serpent Scale Shield, which gives the unit a 5+ invul save against all attacks now and not just range attacks. They're pretty good at holding primary objectives and giving you an edge in the primary objective game, which is kind of hard for Eldar to do. I know that we're not really having much of a problem with it now because we have really strong Wraith units, but it's still a great option to have when your opponent does have the tools to remove your units from objectives, especially in the backfield where they can screen out enemy reserves at the same time as making your objectives sticky, so that you still control them even if your opponent wipes your units on the objectives out. So yeah, you have a unit of Guardian Defenders or a unit of Rangers on an objective. Well, guess what? If your opponent has any hardcore indirect fire, those units are probably not going to be controlling them past turn 4. However, Storm Guardians can fix that pretty easily. And because Storm Guardians aren't typically seen as a threat, opponents usually don't shoot at them. They usually just kind of leave them alone and they just do their thing. Now, they do suck at close combat. They're not great in combat at all, but you don't want to use them that way. You want to use them to kind of just go from objective to objective you control, make them sticky, and be done with it. They also have a good selection of special weapons. I have no complaints about their flamers and fusion guns now that you can actually have weapons, close combat weapons with them. They're not bad. So yeah, I might hate the bastards. I've never liked Storm Guardians, really. I've always thought of them as kind of like a joke or a meme or something like that. But hey, I gotta say, they're not bad in 10th edition. All right, next up is the Warlock Conclave on Foot, which is a B tier unit. Now, you might be wondering, well, Proxy Hammer, what are you talking about? You put the Skyrunners in C tier. How are these guys any better? Well, the fact of the matter is they're cheaper, and you can put them in a Falcon, so when they come out, they can reroll all their wounds, which is really good, especially on a mixed arms unit like Warlocks, who can, kind of do combat a little bit, not really, but kind of, and also shoot pretty effectively. And you'll probably want a Farser in this unit, so you will get the -1 to wound and 4+ feel no pain. The Farser will also benefit from the Falcon, right, rerolling to wound. So these guys are great when dumped out of a Falcon for those wound rerolls. Otherwise, though, they're pretty garbage. If they don't have any damage multipliers, they're not a good unit. and they're way too expensive to protect your Farseer. But if you're willing to invest a little bit in them, they can be decent, and that's why I ended up putting them in B tier. So next up is Wind Riders, and they are an A tier unit. And the reason they're A tier is because they have fantastic range damage with shuriken cannons. They reroll pretty much all of their hits if the target is near an objective, and otherwise they just reroll ones to hit, which is still pretty good. They're also extremely fast, can hit enemies in the flanks very easily, and are pretty good at getting into the enemy deployment zone to score on secondaries as well if you choose to have or run them in minimum units. And if you're running them in big units, they're a great target for things like Guide and Bladestorm. And maybe even the marked target on the Shroud Runners, right? So getting lethal hits or rerolls to hit or anything like that on a big unit of these guys can really spell doom for a lot of enemy units. Now, it is a bit of an investment in points. They do cost 80 points for 3, so a full unit will be, 240, which is nothing to laugh at. But if you are able to protect that unit, they will give you a lot of value over the course of the game. All right, next up is Swooping Hawks. So Swooping Hawks are an A tier unit, just because of the fact that they have very good objective play with their speed and Skyleap, and they have decent anti-infantry capabilities that can be boosted with plunging fire fairly easily. And I know what a lot of you are thinking. They're not as good as they were last edition. Swooping Hawks are garbage, blah, 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 right? However, let me just point out that Swooping Hawks, at least damage-wise, have not changed one bit since last edition, and they've actually decreased considerably in points. And the last time I checked, I think there were 25 points a model in 9th edition, and now they're only about 15 points a model. So they're much cheaper than before, and their damage has remained the same. Yeah, Skyleap is different, but Skyleap now gives them a lot of great objective control, and that's exactly how you want to play these guys. You want to play these guys for the objectives, whether that be popping onto a primary objective that has been recently cleared of enemies, or scoring on secondary objectives like deploy teleport homers or behind enemy lines. And again, they're only 75 points, and they give your opponent a lot to think about. So just those things alone, just the amount of board control and objective play that these guys can provide for you, I think makes them an A tier unit. All right, now for their contemporaries, Warp Spiders. So Warp Spiders play very much like Swooping Hawks, except they are very much more hard-hitting. So they have Torrent on their weapons, and they also have Devastating Wounds. So that combination together is absolutely brutal at clearing infantry off of objectives and also dealing damage to heavy stuff too. And they happen to also be very good at scoring on secondaries as well. Warp Spiders can move 24 inches a turn with their Warp Jump ability, or Flicker Jump ability is what it's actually called. And because they can move so fast, they can score on things like behind enemy lines and deploy teleport homers as well very quickly. However, the difference is Warp Spiders are really good at dealing overwatch damage to enemy units. So if enemy units want to encroach the unit of Warp Spiders to either clear them off an objective they just stole or get them in close combat, they're going to get some hard-hitting overwatch in return. So yeah, with that great set of abilities and the combination of damage potential and speed, Warp Spiders are very easily one of the most competitive units in Warhammer 40k. However, that's not the same for this next unit, which is Shining Spears. So Shining Spears are a D tier unit. They pretty much took a quadruple nerf this edition. They got their range damage nerfed, they got their melee damage nerfed, they got fly nerfed, and of course, lastly and not least, their Exarch got nerfed as well. So yeah, they basically just took hits from every angle. They do, however, do decent damage, but at a really expensive cost. So they are very expensive. They actually went up in points, believe it or not, even though they got quadruply nerfed, which is kind of insane to me. As they are mounted and have fly, they also struggle to charge units within ruins effectively or within different stories of buildings. They quite simply just cannot do it effectively. So these guys are all right at charging units that have, disembarked out of a destroyed transport, units that are already battle shocked so they don't have to worry about Overwatch and things like that out in the open. But other than that, it can be a little bit hard to get them where you want to get them at the right moments. So overall, expensive unit, doesn't really do a whole lot of damage for its cost, and is hard to get it to the right target effectively, which makes them absolutely a D tier unit. And we can only go up from here, right? And in this case, all the way up, because we're talking about the Fire Prism. So the Fire Prism is an S tier unit. I don't think that was any surprise. The reason why is because they're extremely potent at dealing anti-large damage. They're great against monsters. They're great against vehicles. They're great against everything with a pulse, and even then, they're still great against it. They're self-supported. They have 2 rerolls to hit and wound. They have versatile shooting with a dual profile that can also deal decent damage against infantry. Not the greatest, but decent. And the cherry on top, they can draw a line of sight through other prisms, allowing them to deal damage from a safe position. So you only have to use Phantasm on one prism or Fire and Fade in one prism, and all 3 of your prisms get the benefit of being able to hide and still shoot. And because they're not indirect weapons, they don't suffer any of the penalties. Which may be something that will change as September rolls around. These prisms that fire through each other might in fact be counted as an indirect fire weapon. So if a fire prism doesn't have line of sight to its target, but it's firing through another fire prism, you might have to suffer a penalty from it. That's one of the nerfs that possibly could happen. The other nerf that could happen, obviously, is just another points increase. So I bet you would see us, kind of having to pay 175 points for these guys if they nerf them again. Which, I still think it would be good. I have to say, I think people would still take this thing. Maybe they would just take 2 of them, but I still think it would be a staple in most competitive Eldar lists. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, Fire Prism for now, definitely S tier. That may change, obviously, in September, but I don't think it would change by much unless they completely overhauled the whole unit. Up next is its cousin, the Falcon. And the Falcon is also an S tier unit, not because of the damage it can do itself, but because of the buffs it can give the units inside. So units that disembark from it get rerolls to wound against the targets the Falcon hit. This is a huge damage buff and helps units like Fire Dragons and other things hit a lot harder. It can also deep strike as well, giving it deployment versatility. And lastly, it has a good set of weapons itself. It has a pulse laser, which is pretty good, and probably a bright lance, which is also a very strong option. And believe it or not, I actually like to use this thing more defensively. I know people might be tempted to deep strike it, but I like keeping it in the back, and I like just waiting for my opponent to come to me so that I can unleash whatever's inside out of it. So I like using it as more a defensive unit. If I have a unit of Fire Dragons, it's a great deterrent for a lot of enemy vehicles and walkers that might want to come up into range. But it can also be used more offensively in the late game if my opponent doesn't do that. I can actually have the speed to run it up, disembark it, and shoot a key target as well. So it kind of gives me a lot of flexibility, and I really like this thing. I do. I think a lot of people might rate it A tier instead and argue that the units that are put inside of it maybe aren't that great, right? I love Fire Dragons. Some people don't like them, though. And Howling Banshees are not the greatest unit, so I think a lot of people would question why I put this in S tier, but I just think it's such a great damage multiplier, and I think it does a lot on the battlefield, besides just also being a damage multiplier, right? It has good damage itself, has a pulse laser, has a bright lance, so it has strong anti-tank, and it's a very effective transport and a very effective defensive tool. All right, so up next is the Warwalker. So the Warwalker can take 2 heavy weapons. You're probably going to give it bright lances, let's be honest. It is 95 points, so it's a little bit expensive, but for that 95 points, you get Scout, you get -1 to wound, and you get a 4+ invul save, which makes it pretty tough and able to get into better positions early in the game. And it works great with the detachment special rule, right? Reroll 1 to hit, reroll 1 to wound. Or I should really say 1 hit roll and 1 wound roll. But anyway, yeah, the Warwalker is a very strong model, and what I like about it is because it can get better positioning on the battlefield, it can actually bait out some heavier targets into the center of the board. So your opponent might look at this thing and overestimate it and bring out something heavy to kill it because it has, that 4+ invul and -1 to wound. And of course, if your opponent leaves more vulnerable units open in the backfield that have just recently killed the Warwalker, you can take advantage of that as well. So yeah, the Warwalker is a pretty strong model. It's just tough enough to survive, light anti-tank shooting for a couple turns, and it can take some of the best weapons in our index, which currently are the Bright Lances. So definitely think this is an A-tier unit. All right, so moving on to the Avatar of Cain. The Avatar is an S-tier unit. It's extremely tough, having all damage with a 4+ invulnerable save. It's also toughness 12 and has a 2+ armor save. It has amazing shooting in close combat. It has sustained hits D3 on its immensely powerful ranged weapon, which is insane. The Wailing Doom has an insane strength AP and just damage value in general. It also gives friendly units within 6 inches, +1 to charge, and advance rolls. So, if you wanted your units to have a better chance of charging at a reserve with a Fate dice, you can bring the Avatar in with them and give them that better chance. So yeah, the Avatar basically has it all, right? Really tough, really amazing close combat, really good shooting, and is just a very powerful character on the battlefield. And because it's not a towering model, it can easily hide behind obscuring terrain, so it can also be protected by that as well. Next up is Yvraine. And Yvraine is an A-tier unit. She makes her bodyguard tougher with Feel No Pain 5+, and revives D3 models in your command phase. She has a plethora of mortal wound damage in the shooting and combat phases. Again, her shooting is very good. It's anti-infantry with devastating wounds, so that synergizes extremely well. And by the way, it's anti-infantry 2+, which is even better. And if she's your warlord, you gain access to Dark Eldar units, some of which are extremely powerful in Ynnari armies. So yeah, Yvraine is one crazy-ass fucking bitch, and she doesn't fuck around. So she's an A-tier unit, she does immense damage herself, and makes her unit tougher. Next up, we have Dark Reapers, and Dark Reapers are an A-tier unit. Very good range damage against infantry for the cost. They're only 75 points for 5. If you give the Exarch a Tempest Launcher, it gives you access to very cheap indirect fire effective against infantry, and it's the cheapest access to indirect fire we basically have in our index. And, on top of it, Dark Reapers don't suffer negative hit modifiers and ignore cover. Now, the Tempest Launcher itself doesn't ignore cover, but it does ignore hit modifiers. So you're essentially ignoring the negative penalty from indirect fire itself. So yeah, Dark Reapers, very cheap unit, but also have very good damage against infantry for the cost. They ignore hit modifiers, and they also ignore cover. Great unit overall, and definitely an A-tier shooter. Okay, so next up is the Autarch on foot. And the Autarch on foot kind of leaves a lot to be desired and is B-tier. Yes, he grants you 1 command point a turn, and allows the unit it joins to use a stratagem, even if you've already used it that turn. But it can only join Guardians, and it isn't free. And what stratagem are you honestly going to use on Guardians, right? You're probably not. So it's not very good of an ability. He is decent. He is good at farming CP. He's a little cheaper. But he's nowhere as good as his counterpart, the Autarch Wayleaper. So unfortunately, the Autarch on foot is just going to have to stay in B tier. He's okay, just nothing spectacular. Alright, so next up is Assman, or as some of you like to call him, Assman. And Assman is A tier, and he allows Dire Avengers to overwatch for free, even if it had already been used that turn. He gives his unit +1 to hit as well, and he has solid combat and shooting with a 3+ invul save. So he's pretty good, pretty powerful in close combat, supports the Dire Avengers well, gives them a lot of extra damage, and allows them to overwatch twice. So you could have 2 units of Dire Avengers on 2 different objectives, both overwatching on a 4+. And for me, I think Assman is probably one of the best Phoenix Lords just because he helps the Dire Avengers with their role so much. He helps them control the board, which is exactly what they want to do. The next Phoenix Lord we're going to be talking about is K'Handras. So K'Handras is really good. As far as his combat prowess goes, he's very effective. He has attacks that can devastate light infantry or heavy infantry alike. He gives his unit +1 to hit, and he gives himself a 4+ critical if he charged. So that means his sustained hits will score criticals on a 4+ rather than a 6+. So he's really good. His problem, though, is that even though he hits harder, he doesn't really do anything that Scorpions couldn't just do themselves. Another unit of Scorpions could very easily not only deny more board space from enemy infiltrators, but put more pressure on enemy units, and just do more damage in general. So K'Handras, even though he's good, he doesn't really add much to the Scorpions themselves, which is why I think he does belong in B tier. Yeah, he's a good combat model, but he's no longer damage gated like he was last edition, and he doesn't really do a lot for his friendly Scorpions. So that's why he's a B tier unit and not an A tier one. And now we come to the mighty Wave Serpent. So the Wave Serpent is a B tier unit. Yeah, I would have labeled it A tier before just because of the fact that it could use its, special ability anytime and not just during the shooting phase like it can now to cause D3 mortal wounds and force a battle shock test on an enemy unit within 12 inches. But now since it can only use it in the shooting phase, it's a little bit worse. It does have a 5+ invul save and an extra wound over a Falcon or Fire Prism, and it can transport up to 12 models or 6 rates. So it's definitely good, and you're probably going to have a Wave Serpent in your list if you're using, Aspect Warriors, or if you want to transport something bigger. But other than that, it's really not an auto-include. So you don't need it in a list. It's not necessary to have one, but it is a good option for bigger units like Dire Avengers. And I think some lists will need them, and some won't, and I just think it's an okay transport in general. Nothing spectacular, but decent for its cost. And it's finally that time. For those of you wondering when I was going to talk about the Wraith Knight and how OP it was, it's now. The Wraith Knight is an S tier unit, but if there was something above S tier, I would probably give it that because it's absolutely breaking the tournament meta. It's extremely powerful because it has a combination of devastating wounds and towering, two of the most OP mechanics together in one model. On top of that, it's very tough with -1 damage, toughness 12, and a 2+ save, so even if opponents want to kill it, it's going to be extremely hard, especially with a Farseer casting Fortune on it every turn for a -1 to wound on top of it all. And it's very good for other buff stacking as well, like Guide. So if you want to throw Guide on it to make it more accurate, you certainly can. And it will certainly thank you for it because it has a lot of heavy, hardcore range damage. So yeah, this thing is stupidly good and probably belongs in a whole nother tier by itself. Moving on from the Wraith Knight, we have the Solitaire. So the Solitaire is A tier. Now the reason why is because it has insane threat range, it has very powerful melee with precision. This thing can take Abaddon out of a unit of Terminators like that. It's really easy for him to do it as long as you don't get Overwatched. He is weak to Overwatch, but he's a lone operative with a 3+ invulnerable save as well, so he can survive some minor damage. And is generally just much harder to target. Now the cool thing about this guy is he synergizes really well with things like Phantasm because of his lone operative ability. So if he charges in, kills something, consolidates onto an objective, if your opponent wants to engage the Solitaire within 12, you could easily just Phantasm and get right out of range again. So very cool model. Definitely invest in it if you are going to use it though. Definitely use Phantasm and things like that on it. Don't use it as just a simple trading piece, because if you do that, you're not going to get its full value. So it is an A tier unit. It's very powerful. It does have some weaknesses against Overwatch and things like that, but in general, it's a very strong piece. However, another Harlequin model, the Shadowseer, is now absolute trash. It was great in 9th edition, and now it just sucks. It allows its unit to advance in charge, as well as reroll advance rolls, but has to be used at the start of the movement phase, so you can't use it when you disembark. Yes, that's correct. I actually didn't know this until somebody brought it up in my comment section and said, yeah, you actually can't use this ability when you disembark. So this unit is even worse than I thought before, and even though it gives its unit stealth, who cares? If anything is shooting at a Harlequin unit out in the open, stealth or not, you're dead. Your unit's going to die. And that's it. Stealth isn't going to save you. And it doesn't really have any offensive capabilities that make up for its basically lack of strong abilities. And that's it. It sucks. It's bad. You don't want to take one. You want to take Troop Masters on your troops, or you just want to invest in other stuff. The Shadowseer is definitely a model you do not want to take. The Death Jester, on the other hand, is something you want to take every single game. This thing is an S tier unit. It's fantastic anti-infantry damage with devastating wounds. It can give his range attack sustained 3, or precision, which can kill characters or murder entire infantry units. It also causes battle shock tests on top of it. And it is a lone operative as well, so it's extremely hard to attack. The Death Jester is just an amazing unit overall. And to give you guys an example of how strong this guy can be, when I was going up against Chaos Knights and the rest of my army was getting manhandled, this guy alone pretty much soloed a War Dog by himself. He did an insane amount of damage to it. Because he has devastating wounds sustained 3 together with Fate's Messenger, he can absolutely blend most targets, even vehicles. So yeah, this guy is an amazing model. His lone operative keeps him alive and keeps him dealing consistent damage over the course of the game. You honestly won't be sorry for picking up this guy in your army, and that's why he's without a doubt an S tier unit. Alright, so let's talk about Wraith Blades. So Wraith Blades, in my opinion, are an A tier unit because they're super tough. If you take the 4 shields, they get a 4+ invulnerable save. They have good anti-heavy infantry damage, and yeah, they're not going to hit well against things like Terminators up front, but they're going to do pretty well against anything with 2 wounds, and they fight on death on a 4+, which gives them a little bit of extra damage when they do finally die. And that makes them great at holding objectives or different parts of the battlefield. So I don't actually like to put these guys in the middle of the battlefield. As an Eldar player, typically you don't want to throw your units out in the middle, even if you have a tough unit like Wraith Blades. So what I like to do is I like to take a unit and put it on the flank, making sure that my faster units that are trying to sneak around have an anchor. And that way you don't have to worry about losing your objective once your faster units move on. So yeah, Wraith Blades, A tier unit. You definitely want to take the 4 shield variant. The Ghost Sword variant isn't that great. I think they basically do the same job a lot of other units do in our codex. So you definitely want to pick up that 4+ invul save, which is invaluable against a lot of different factions. And you may not think it, but there are several factions with high AP weapons or abilities that ignore armor completely, like the Thousand Suns, who would absolutely love to target units without an invul save. So, Wraith Blades, overall, pretty good unit. Pretty solid rock that you can stick on a flank on, a side objective or something like that, and they're not going to go anywhere soon. And then we have probably the most auto-include model in the entire book, and that is the Autarch Wayleaper. So the Autarch Wayleaper is an S tier unit, gives you a command point in your command phase, and gives units within 6 inches +1 on leadership and battle shock tests, which may not seem like a lot, but in the backfield, it's good at keeping your units controlling objectives. He also is a lone operative, has fly, and has decent combat potential. So when you mix all these things together, you get basically a perfect leader for your army. He is going to be your warlord, he is going to be generating command points, but he's also basically going to be unkillable under the right circumstances. So if you're having a pretty close game and you don't throw him out there to basically die in the midfield, he's pretty hard to kill. With lone operative and the ability to fly, he can get away from a lot of really hairy situations, especially with things like Phantasm, right? So just like I told you guys with the Death Jester and the Solitaire, you can use Phantasm on this guy to get him to safety if an opponent is trying to get within 12 inches of him. And next up, we have the Spiritseer, who is an A tier model. So he revives 1 Wraith in your command phase, so either a Wraith Blade or a Wraith Guard. That's a really good ability. Even though it was better before, it is still a powerful ability to be able to resurrect a Wraith Guard, which is pretty good. Gives his unit +1 to hit and lethal hits, so Wraith Guard and Wraith Blades hit a little bit better on a 3+ instead of a 4+, and they get lethal hits on top of it, which is pretty good. He is also a great recipient of the Fate's Messenger or Phoenix Gem enhancements, synergizing really well. So Fate's Messenger synergizes well with Wraithguard for devastating wounds, or if you want to play more defensive and protect yourself against precision weapons, you can go with the Phoenix Gem. So overall, great support piece for Wraithguard and Wraithblades. I definitely recommend if you're taking a unit of 10, take the Spiritseer, and even then, if you're taking just a unit of 5, I would still consider it. Because with Fate's Messenger, a unit of 5 Wraithguard can do some serious mortal wound damage to enemy units. So coming off our high, we have the Hemlock Wraithfighter, who of course is a D tier unit. Why D tier? Well, it does have anti-infantry, but it's really short ranged. It must come from reserve, so chances are you're not going to be in range of a great target. And it also has one of the most worthless abilities in the game, which enemies within 9 inches are at -1 to battle shock and leadership tests, which isn't that great, and on top of that, you can't even use it when you come in on the battlefield. And that's because you need to be outside of 9 inches of enemy units. So unfortunately, this thing is just going to be relegated to the shelf. I actually think it's one of the worst units in the D tier, probably worse than, Shining Spears, and arguably worse than the Shadow Seer as well, just because of the fact that it's never really going to be used that much, and it doesn't have anything special that makes it worthwhile taking. So unfortunately, even though it's cool, the Hemlock Wraithfighter is going to remain on my shelf this edition, or at least until we get a new codex. The Wraith Guard, on the other hand, are an S tier unit, absolutely, 100%. Yes, they did recently get nerfed. They got the pistol keyword basically taken away from them, but they still have very powerful shooting and are extremely tough. They're very cost effective, they can shoot at enemies when attacked, even though they can't do so in combat. They have fantastic devastating wound potential with their Wraith Cannons. The other option, the D-Scythe, is also pretty good, and you can definitely make it work, although the D-Scythe is just going to be better versus hordes, whereas the Wraith Cannons are going to be better against almost everything else. So tanks, heavy infantry, big monsters, things like that, the Wraith Cannons are your clear choice. But if you want your Wraith Guard to clear hordes out, the D-Scythes are a good option for that. They do have a short range, so you do have to kind of be careful in positioning and make sure they're positioned well so that you can use their ability. Okay, so moving on to the Wraith Lord. The Wraith Lord is an A-tier unit. The Wraith Lord, I think, got a pretty good improvement this edition from where it was last edition, and I thought it was a pretty solid choice before. It's very durable with toughness 11 and a 2+ save. It has lots of ranged firepower with 2 flamers or catapults. You definitely want to take the flamers though, because they auto hit, and Wraith Lords don't hit the best. They hit on 4+. And you can also take 2 heavy weapons. Typically, I like to take the Bright Lances or missile launchers. The missile launchers, of course, being better for targeting infantry as well as vehicles and monsters. So the reason why you take that is for their special ability. Their special ability gives you a fate dice for each unit killed by it, so if you happen to run out of vehicle targets, you can still get value out of the Wraith Lord by picking off infantry targets with the missile launcher's plasma shots. It also has great melee damage with the Ghost Glaive, and overall is just a great denial unit because of the stratagem Heroic Intervention. So is also a great model at defending your backline. So if a model deep strikes in or tries to assault you from reserve, from the back of your table edge, if you have a Wraith Lord nearby and you have the command points, Heroic Intervention will pay dividends for you and make sure that your backline isn't wiped out by a small combat unit. Speaking of units that are going to be in the backline, Maugan Ra, the Phoenix Lord of the Dark Reapers, is unfortunately this edition a C-tier unit. Maugan Ra did not get, in my opinion, any better than he was last edition. In fact, I think he's a little bit worse, and I hate to say it like that, but I think he is. So he does give his unit +1 to hit and gets rerolls to hit and wound versus targets below half strength, but he doesn't confer this to the Dark Reaper unit he's with. And believe it or not, even this ability is not that good. He already hits on a 2+, and against most infantry targets, he's going to be wounding on a 3+. So the rerolls are nice, but you kind of already have unparalleled mastery. You're not going to be needing to roll that many dice. It is good, again, but also it has a precondition, right? The target has to be below half strength, which isn't great. He has decent shooting, but nothing spectacular. And close combat is not somewhere where he wants to be. So although I love his lore and I love his model, he's really just not that great. Maybe if his ability applied to the unit, he'd be a lot better and he'd be an A tier. But unfortunately, as a solo act, he just doesn't cut it. And in fact, the Death Jester will often outdamage him for much lower points. Okay, so moving on to Skyweavers. Skyweavers are an A tier unit, not because they do incredible amounts of damage, but because they're a very strong utility unit for the cost with solid vehicle damage as well. They can also scrap heavy infantry with Starbows or Zephyr Glaives, and on top of that, they're pretty decent at objective play. They're very fast. If you need them in a certain spot of the board, they can get there very quickly, and also are decently durable with their 4+ invulnerable save against high AP shots. So while this unit won't be murdering entire units by itself, it can finish up squads for you and just basically act as a Swiss Army knife for the rest of your army. Alright, so now it's time for everybody's favorite pirate unit, the Void Reavers and Void Scarred. So they're in B tier. They have Scout 7, which gives them better positioning, which is a really good ability. They have versatile weapon options. They can either take anti-infantry weapons of Shredders and Shuriken Cannons, or anti-large options of Blasters or Wraith Cannons. The Void Reavers reroll hits of 1 or all hits if the target unit is in range of an objective. And the Void Scarred can pick a unit in the beginning of the game and gain precision and lethal hits against that unit, as well as take a bunch of special models as well. Now, the reason why I think these guys are B tier and not higher though is they are a little bit expensive for the damage they do. So even though they are very good, they tend to be a little bit pricey, and they also don't benefit from Strands of Fate. So that's kind of a killer to me. I think if they did benefit from Strands of Fate, if they were able to use Fate dice, they would definitely be a little bit higher up on the list, probably an A tier unit in my opinion. but alas, they don't have it, so they can't synergize with their Wraith Cannons or Blasters to do extra damage or, other stuff like that, proc devastating wounds and so forth. So I still think they're a good unit, though. I still think they're solid. They're good at getting up the board, getting into better positions, and dealing damage. And for that, they're definitely a solid B tier unit. Jane Czar, however, is not. She is a C tier Phoenix Lord. So why is she C tier? Because she seems like she's pretty good, right? She gives free heroic intervention to her unit, which, while very good, is pretty situational. Just think about it. How many times have you actually had a game where your Howling Banshees, after charging out and killing an enemy unit, were in a position to heroically intervene against something, right? It is a good stratagem for certain units, just not for Howling Banshees, right? However, other than that, she has pretty good combat power. She gives her unit +1 to hit, which does help Banshees hit a lot harder. She's just not that great with their ability. So the ability is rarely going to be used, and, paying a good amount of extra points for just +1 to hit and some extra combat prowess doesn't exactly make her a good choice. And same goes for the Autarch Skyrunner. So the Autarch Skyrunner does give you 1 command point in your command phase. However, his ability is kind of garbage. Gives an auto 6-inch advance to his unit. However, he can only join Wind Riders and has limited weapon options. And because Wind Riders want to be taking, weapons that require you to, not advance to shoot, like Shuriken Cannons and Scatter Lasers, he really has no place in a unit of Wind Riders. And by himself, he's just simply not as good as the Autarch Wayleaper. So the Autarch Skyrunner has less options, he's not a lone operative, and his combat isn't that great. Even with the Laser Lance, I think the Autarch Wayleaper can give him a run for his money with your basic Starglaive. So unfortunately, the Autarch Skyrunner, for now, is in C tier. Now, Illic Nightspear, the famous ranger of the Elatok, is S tier. And the reason why is because he essentially gives his unit of rangers lone operative, making them really hard to target. So having an untargetable unit of rangers outside of 12 is a really powerful tool to have in your army against a lot of different opponents. It gives you protection against towering, which is one of the, most hard-hitting things in the current meta. He also gives his unit rerolls to wound, which is nice, right? Especially with precision weapons. And he has decent precision damage himself. It's nothing spectacular, but it is decent. So Illic and his rangers are able to, take out some minor characters and also be untargetable, which means they can perform actions or sit on objectives carefree. And that is what makes him an S tier unit. Okay, so moving on to Guardian Defenders now. Guardian Defenders are a B tier unit, just like Storm Guardians. However, I do think Guardian Defenders are a little bit better because they gain a fate dice for controlling objectives, which is useful. It's not as useful as it was before, but it is still decently good. They trade pretty evenly as well with other basic troops like intercessors and stuff like that. I know it may not seem like it, but on paper, if they're just shooting at each other, they trade pretty effectively, although that situation probably won't happen. They nevertheless will trade pretty well against those types of units and can take a heavy weapon and make a great Farseer bodyguard. So overall, I think they're a solid unit. They're a B tier unit, not as great as they were when the edition first started, but certainly something worth to consider for sitting on a backfield objective. So moving on to the Void Weaver. The Void Weaver is an A tier unit. It's very cost-effective anti-large or infantry, depending on what you equip it with. It's fairly durable for the cost with a 4+ invulnerable save and forces battle shock tests on units hit. So its prismatic cannon hits very, effectively against anything toughness 11 and below. It also hits infantry pretty effectively as well, and the Haywire cannon is great against vehicles. I do recommend the prismatic cannon, however, because it's just so versatile. But if you did want to go with the Haywire Cannon against certain matchups, that's not a bad idea either. And I think the Void Weaver is basically just good for its cost, right? It's only 100 points, it has a 4+ invul, so it has decent durability. It also has good damage for the cost and is very fast as well and has a low profile, so it's easy to hide. Pretty good unit, and in my opinion, deserves A tier. The Crimson Hunter, on the other hand, is a D tier unit. So unfortunately, the Crimson Hunter is not that great. However, it is better than some of the other units in D tier, and it's probably one of the best D tier units. It has a Pulse Laser and 2 Bright Lances. which you're always going to take over the star cannons, so it has some decent punch against tanks and monsters. It's fairly effective against large units with fly as well, but it's really expensive and doesn't compare well to other options for the points. It's like 160 points, so it's extremely cost inefficient. So it is better than the other options, but still doesn't make it that great, and that's why it belongs in D tier. Moving on to the Night Spinner. The Night Spinner is obviously an S tier unit. It has fantastic anti-infantry indirect fire with devastating wounds and twin linked. A unit hit is also at -2 movement and can't advance, making it a great board control piece. So it can basically slow units down to a crawl. It can make fast units considerably slower, or it can basically eliminate slow units from the game. So big units of Terminators that have movement 5 are now going to be moving 3 inches. And on top of that, can no longer advance. So it's going to take turn after turn after turn for a big unit like that to get onto the center objective, which can swing the battle in your favor majorly. So the Night Spinner, not the best damage in the world for the points at 170, but having indirect fire and being able to slow enemy units down makes the rest of your list a lot more maneuverable, and of course allows you to control the board easier. As for Fuegan, this is truly a rags to riches story. Fuegan was basically garbage last edition. He was only really good for a cheap trick with Dire Vendors to allow them to shoot twice, but now he's actually awesome, and he's an S tier unit. He has amazing anti-large with Melta 6 and Strength 14, as well as the ability to revive on a 2+, and has a powerful punch in close combat. He also gives Fire Dragons +1 to hit. And just to give you an idea of how good Fuegan is, he can basically one-shot a 12 wound model with the Strands dice. Yes, that's right. This guy can one-shot a vehicle with the Strands dice. That is pretty freaking insane. The fact that he also revives on a 2+ means that even if your opponent kills him, he can do it again the next turn. So Fuegan, definitely an S tier unit, not only gives Fire Dragons a boost, but also is just great himself. Prince Riel is up next, and he's B tier. So Prince Riel is a pretty good model, and maybe some of you think he should be higher, but I think that he's just a little bit below A tier, because even though you can redeploy up to 3 units after both sides have deployed, you can't do it after determining who gets first turn. So unfortunately, you're not going to have that little bit of insight. So he is good, just not as good as Phantasm was last edition. He also gives his unit +1 objective control, which is super solid with a unit that's going to be focusing on objectives. So either taking objectives or holding objectives. He also has a decent combat profile, but again, he is 100 points, so he's more expensive than even the Autarch Wayleaper. And the redeployment ability, although powerful, is not nearly what it was last edition. So unfortunately, I love Prince Riel. He's in a lot of my lists, but he is a B tier unit for now. All right, so moving on to the Lynx. The Lynx is an A tier unit. So the Lynx is something that wasn't that great last edition. Few people used it here and there, but it really wasn't considered all that great. It can advance and shoot though. It's pulsar, and basically its pulsar is just a more powerful pulse laser, and it advances 9 inches automatically, giving it insane threat range. So this thing can move 14 inches and auto advance 9 and still shoot, which gives it insane angles for line of sight. It's also a bit tougher than the other grav tanks and is fairly cost efficient. It's only 155 points, and I suspect this will become much better if the Prism is nerfed again. So if the Prism goes up to 175 points, 180 points, maybe you'll start seeing people filling in a Lynx into their lists. The next forge-ruled unit we're going to talk about is, of course, the Hornet, which is an S tier unit. So the Hornet packs 2 Eldar heavy weapons. It causes mortal wounds to a unit it moves over, and it's a bit tougher than a Viper and faster than a Warwalker. And it kind of takes the best of both from the Viper and the Warwalker and combines it for a low cost of 80 points. The Hornet is an extremely cost-effective unit. It only costs 80, like I said, has a low profile, easy to hide, and also packs a serious punch. So yeah, the Hornet, in my opinion, one of the best units in the index, and definitely deserves its spot at S tier. Shadow Spectres are another example of an S tier forge-ruled unit. They have fantastic anti-infantry with their disperse shot, or anti-heavy infantry with their focus shot. They can move 6 inches after shooting as well, and have stealth on top of that, so they're extremely hard to hit, even with indirect fire. And because they have fly, they can get up into ruins to benefit from plunging fire and gives themselves some extra AP. And they also synergize well with units like Shroud Runners. And all that for the low cost of 80 points. Next up on the list is the Wraith Seer, who is B tier. Now I know what a lot of you are saying, well, the Wraith Lord's A tier, how is the Wraith Seer B tier? So even though it has solid defensive stats, which are the same as the Wraith Lord, it also boasts a 5+ invulnerable save, which isn't as important now that the Wraith Lord has a 2+ armor save. It can take one Eldar heavy weapon, including a toned down D cannon, which in my opinion is just the worst choice over a Bright Lance, just because it also has a really low range of 24 inches. It also has the Destructor shooting attack and forces battle shock tests on enemy units it hits in the shooting phase, and has solid combat with anti-horde or precision. I just find that the Wraith Seer is a little bit less useful than the Wraith Lord because it has a lot less range attacks. It basically, instead of 2 flamers, has Destructor, which Destructor is not as good as just having 2 regular flamers, obviously. And the 1 heavy weapon, it does have access to hits on a 4+, whereas the Wraith Lord at least gets 2 heavy weapons to try to hit its target with. So yeah, you do get a reroll with Unparalleled Mastery, but even so, in my opinion and in my experience, the Wraith Seer just seems to miss with its heavy weapon, and that means that half of its ability, being able to hit with the heavy weapon to cause battle shock, is rendered useless. So the Wraith Seer is still a solid piece, works good with Wraith Lords and things like that. I just don't think it's as good as the Wraith. Alright, so moving on to the Nightwing. The Nightwing is a D tier unit, and I'm just going to save you some time here and just go through it really quick. It has twin Bright Lance, twin Shuriken Cannon, so it doesn't really have that much firepower. It can hover, so it loses all of its aircraft rules, so you don't have to start with it in reserve, but it's high up off the ground and very easy to see. It has a 5+ invulnerable, but is really squishy otherwise, and it does get +1 to hit versus models with fly, but doesn't have the damage output to benefit much from it. It's definitely a vehicle that also just does not know what it wants to do. It doesn't know whether it wants to hunt tanks or heavy infantry. So really, I think the Nightwing is probably one of the worst flyers. I think it's a little bit better than the Hemlock, but probably a fair bit worse than the Crimson Hunter. The Skata Wraith Knight, on the other hand, is an A tier unit. So I hope I pronounced that right this time. It does carry either 2 anti-large or 2 anti-infantry weapons. The anti-infantry Death Shroud Cannon has devastating wounds, while the Inferno Lance has Melta 2. And I really love the Death Shroud Cannons. I think they're definitely the way to go with this thing. It also has Deep Strike and a once per game Sky Leap, which allows it to come back through reserve via Deep Strike. And overall, I just think this is a really well-designed unit. You know, I think the Wraith Knight has a broken combination of towering and devastating wounds, but this thing actually seems very well balanced and designed, and it's currently just being overshadowed by the Wraith Knight for being so ungodly powerful, right? The Wraith Knight is an absolute beast, and again, like I said, if there was a tier above Esther, the Wraith Knight would be there. So the fact that the Skata Wraith Knight is really powerful and also kind of balanced make it an intriguing pickup when the Wraith Knight inevitably gets nerfed in September. So for that, it's A tier for now, but will probably be S tier in the matter of a couple of weeks. We also have the Warp Hunter, which is a B tier unit. It does force a battle shock test on an enemy unit hit in the shooting phase, but its weapon is kind of lackluster. It's essentially a lesser D cannon with a torrent fire mode. Yes, it's fast, it's maneuverable, it's tougher than a D cannon, but it does less damage. I don't know. I don't really like this thing personally. If anybody has had some experience with this thing that's, been actually effective, let me know. But on paper, it just looks kind of meh. Having said that, though, it does have a D weapon that does devastating wounds. So it can do some significant damage if you're rolling hot or if you want to put a little bit of investment into it. All right. And last, but almost least, we have Irilith, the Shadow Spectre's Phoenix Lord. And you would think that Shadow Spectre's being so good, this guy would also be great. But in fact, he's not. In fact, I think he damages the squad by being with them just because of the fact that he is kind of expensive. So he's pretty powerful at shooting. He does have strength 8, AP -2, and damage 4 with his weapon. And it has 4 shots, I believe. But it's only really good against 4 wound models or higher. Anything less than that, and you're not really getting a lot of good value out of the weapon. He does give his unit +1 to hit, but his ability is absolutely abysmal. Enemy units within 6 are at -1 to leadership and battle shock tests. You never want to be within 6 of any enemy unit with this unit. So yeah, his ability unfortunately isn't good. He does have kind of decent shooting, solid shooting, but overall just not a great unit, so he belongs in C tier. Alright, so that wraps up our tier list, and in conclusion, we do have a great roster of solid units that each fill a niche in our army and can be useful, and even the lower tier units are pretty decent, pretty good. However, a lot of our units are really good, and I'm talking A tier and above. If you look at the list, most of our units are A or S tier. And we are blessed with a great selection to choose from, I have to say. And I hope this will continue past the September data slate. I do expect several of our units to get nerfed, however, including the D-Cannon, Wraith Knight, and Fire Prism. However, I hope the rest of our units are relatively untouched. I'd hate to see a lot of the cool units that we have now relegated to, really high points costs and things like that just make them very inefficient. So hopefully our extremely high tournament win rate won't mean that our entire force gets nerfed and only the units that are problematic will end up getting nerfed. But it looks like we're just going to have to wait and see, because really, I don't put anything past GW. Alright everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Sorry it took so long to come out with it. It was really a work in progress, I have to say. There was quite a few times where I was just like, man, this is taking too long, but I just wanted to do a good job on it for you and get all the units and, have something meaningful to say about each and every one. So thank you once again for bearing with me on that one. Thank you also to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last months. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it succeed. If you do want to join Patreon and help support the channel, I do have free trials activated. Free trials will give you access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players who love talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying, and I'll leave the link in the description for you as well. I also have a channel store page for those of you looking to rep your favorite faction in your local game store. So if you want to pick up some Eldar-inspired apparel, I'll leave the link in the description also. All right, everybody, have a good one. Peace out. Thanks for bearing with me on that one, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.